Okay, so this is a webinar that is organized by the AAEA Mentorship Committee. It's happens twice a year, and this particular webinar is going to focus on funding and grant writing strategies in agricultural economics. I'm Madhu Khanna from the University of Illinois, and this is jointly co-organized with Vincenzina Caputo from Michigan State University. As you all know, funding is a increasingly important and it's a timely topic. Funding is needed to support our research, advance our careers, and support graduate programs in our departments. But at the same time, developing competitive grant proposals is time consuming, risky, and requires building effective research teams, managing funded projects, which presents both significant challenges as well as great learning opportunities. And particularly for early career scholars, this can be daunting, but also a rewarding task if done correctly. And so in this webinar, you're going to hear from three ag economists who've had extensive experience with grant writing, interdisciplinary research, and working in large teams. They have obtained substantial research support from a wide range of public and private sources, government agencies, as well as foundations. And we have asked them today to share their perspectives and practical experiences on this topic, describe their journey of grant writing and fundraising through their career, and provide some advice on the do's and don'ts to look out for. So we will have the three presentations first, about 10 minutes from each of the three presenters, and then have time for Q&A at the end. So please hold your questions to the end, or you can even write your questions and comments in the chat at any time, and we can come back to them at the end of the presentations. We have, three distinguished colleagues as panelists. Their list of accomplishments, grants, and awards is impressive and long and pretty wide-ranging from both a national to an international focus in terms of their sources of funding and the work that they do. And so it really provides a broad range of expertise that I hope will be useful for our participants. I'm going to just briefly introduce them. We're going to start with Shadi Atallah. Shadi is an associate professor in the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's also co-director of the Center for the Economics of Sustainability. He got his PhD from Cornell University, and he conducts disciplinary and interdisciplinary research on sustainable pest management, as well as non-market valuation, and has received grants from numerous, sources, particularly NIFA, NSF, and Nature Conservancy. So I'm going to turn it over to Shadi to give his talk. And Shadi, I can start the slide deck.
Sounds good. Thank you, Madhu. Hi, everyone. I will focus my presentation on, apart from the obvious, getting the grant funding, like why is it a good thing to do? We can go to the next slide. So I'll start with the agencies that have most influenced my experience with grant writing. And you will see that it's important to use those because this is where I got my experience, which could be very different depending on where everybody gets their funding from. So for me, it's been mostly from NIFA, actually for the disciplinary grants, and the Specialty Crop Research Initiative for the interdisciplinary ones. And very recently, this was just yesterday, the Organic Agriculture Research and Extension Initiative, my very first endeavor. And then a recent grant that we received is with the Department of Energy. I never thought that my work could be funded by the Department of Energy, Advanced Research Projects Agency. Very influenced by grants that I wrote, what we used to be called the Coupled Natural Human Systems, and the Nature Conservancy. So those influenced my experience, which could be very different for different fields and agencies. Next slide. So the first, why do it? And again, apart from the obvious of getting the funding to do the work, I have found that it's a unique way for me to keep learning about what's going on in other sciences and fields. It's of course you could do it by reading the papers, but grant writing with people from other disciplines is an intimate environment to learn about what's going on. My formative experience was getting a 3-day retreat to write a coupled natural human system NSF grant where I learned about that concept, which I had not learned about in grad school before. Ended up using it as a framework later on, even 10 years later for another grant, and learned about other disciplines, human dimensions of natural resources and wildlife ecology, which I end up engaging with in my work. The first why do it is it's a great way to learn what's going on outside of our field in addition to within our field of economics. The second one is if we care about being relevant to society, and that's becoming increasingly important given the recent disconnect between society and the academy, I have appreciated that especially the interdisciplinary NIFA grants, by definition, they drive you to work on emerging issues. Many of them have a pre-proposal that has to be approved by a group of stakeholders. Before you even start, you are stamped that you are relevant to that industry. And so you know that you are on the right track to solving the problem at hand. And you could use that panel of advisory members every year to let them know what's going on. You could get feedback from them, and then you could use that to keep informing your work. So as a result, it turns out that a grant-funded project, in addition to giving the funds, it's a conduit to having impact through timely problem solving. That's the second one. The third one, as to why to do it, is that we talk about impact and the importance of impact. I have found these grants to be a great impact on other disciplines. So since when I first graduated, the requests were about, could you help us do a cost-benefit analysis? And then it turns out then after telling them what we could do in addition to that or different ways of doing it, then the next grant, could you help us build a bioeconomic model that can help us find the economically justified best management strategy? And then it moved on to, we're developing this technology, but instead of bringing you at the end to look at the impact, could you help us incorporate how a farmer would think about that so that we can prioritize whether we should make the robots faster or more accurate? Or even more recently, how can we take these models and then feed them into LLMs that are farmer-facing for decision-making? So I felt like there was as a profession, we have become much, much more relevant to other disciplines. And I think that's a great impact that we're able to have at the intellectual level on other disciplines. And then the last one that I'll mention is that it's a great way to learn. If you're interested in team science, it's a great way to learn. And to do team science, you need to have a group. To have a group, you need to fund them. And out of the 11 PhD students that I have advised or co-advised, 8 of them have been grant funded. So the way I think about it is that without those grants, I might not have had those students. It's a great way to develop people management skills and learn how to develop a team, not only for the science, but also for the vision and the values about how we do what we do. It's also a great window into how science is done by other disciplines and how we could learn from that to do it in our own discipline, which functions differently. Of course, developing team science skills, leadership skills, and learning how to develop not only mentorship skills, but mentorship plans, like how you can write those with your mentees. And then in the next slide, I'll talk about how we can get started. If you just graduated, how do you do it? What has helped me is to go to seminars on my campus. If I look back, most of my grants were initiated by this one talk that I gave in my second week on my first job that led to invitations to join large teams later on. And so say yes to these opportunities or seek them out if you can. I participate in every single grant writing program my institutions gave. So if you have those, do them and use them to have your first proposal written at the end of the program. Visit the program officer if you can. Once we get back to a time where we can visit program officers and develop a relationship with them. Write a lot of internal grants and get proofs of concepts and preliminary data. And certainly volunteer and accept invitations to review grants and serve on grant panels from the campus level to the national level, including the state level ones. These are very important to understand how the system works. Next. Before you start grant writing and before you invite other PIs to join you or before you join grants, ask more senior people around you whether somebody has worked with people and learn about their experiences and decide accordingly. Discuss with your collaborators what makes them excited. Like it's important that everybody is equally excited as opposed to one person is doing the work that the other person is going to need. Everybody on that grant will need to be excited for it to be to work for them both financially and intellectually. Start by developing a relationship with your sponsored programs administrator. They will help you a lot, and your Office of Research in your college. They will help you a lot as well. So that's before grant writing. Now, as you are writing the grant, I found it important to discuss the dependencies across objectives with other PIs and co-PIs and come up with contingency plans for when one objective depended too much on the previous one, what would be the plan B there. Start the budgets. It could be very uncomfortable for PIs and co-PIs to end up with budgetary situations that were not discussed initially. So discuss those at the very beginning. There are different models of doing that. Some grants, the PIs and the objectives are split equally and others differently. So discuss those at the very beginning. Once those are out of the way, I found that it makes for a much healthier relationship. Use all the support your institution has as you are writing the grant and even after you write it to be compliant with everything that we have to be compliant with. And definitely ask colleagues to read and provide feedback on your proposal. Next. And then I end with some of the challenges. Some of the challenges are there, but they're not different from any life problems and people problems. One major challenge is sometimes you might have to separate the RA work from what is going to be a dissertation for the graduate student you're funding on a grant. So these are important discussions to have and to understand when are they the same and when they are not. I have found that decisions that I made at the very beginning had consequences to the mix of disciplinary and interdisciplinary portfolio, and be aware of that and make sure that it is consistent with what you want and what your institution expects. A recent challenge is that grants can be revoked. I never thought that could be the case, but that's something that happens. And this is when you end up realizing that with grant writing, you must be adaptable the way a small business owner is adaptable when the money is taken away, but you still have to pay the bills. How do you do it? So that's a good skill to have as well. And then things can get out of hand quickly as the group gets larger. The grants, there's a team missing there, they get large. And so it's important to start then realizing at what point you need to start also incorporating budget for a program manager or postdocs in your work. But I would say all of these challenges are manageable. All of those are challenges that will help you develop skills that you might not develop otherwise if you're not in that grant writing enterprise. I would say if any of the why should you do it is something that you get excited about, I will say go ahead and go for it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Shadi. All right, while we are having our next presenter, well, maybe I should introduce our next presenter first and then have her all right, so our next presenter is Saweda. Yeah, our next presenter is Saweda Liverpool-Tasie. She's an Michigan State University Research Foundation Distinguished Professor in the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics. and she's also an alum of the University of Illinois. She's currently the research director for the MSU AFRI's International Development Research. Her research focuses on smallholder productivity and welfare within dynamic food markets in sub-Saharan Africa. She has extensive experience with research projects and numerous research projects in several countries in Africa, and with significant funding from the Gates Foundation and USAID and several other sources. So, without further ado, I will let Saweda tell you about some of the exciting work she's doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Madhu, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to Madhu and Vincenzina for inviting me. So to talk a little bit about my own experience of securing grants to fund my research program. I think, part of what was noted in the webinar is kind of our trajectory. But I think that I am an alumni of UIUC, but I'm going to focus on two aspects of my career that I think are relevant to kind of the discussion today about securing funds. One has to do with the fact that, kind of the amount of time it takes. And so during my time as an assistant professor here at MSU between 2012 and 2018, I had two kind of significant things that happened. One was the fact that I was raising two young children. So I had one child shortly after I accepted the offer to come to MSU and came to East Lansing with a 6-month-old. And then we subsequently had our daughter. I also secured and managed a $12.5 million research grant whilst I was an assistant professor. And I mentioned this because many people thought that was not a good idea for an assistant professor to do that. And many people still think that that's not a good idea. But it was an important part of my journey, and one that if I went back, I think I would still take advantage of that opportunity, but I would do things differently. But it's one that I wouldn't give up because it did help me learn a lot about myself and my research and contributed to my research program. So just before I go into talk about my own experience, I think I just wanted to highlight sort of, yes, it's a lot of time that we put into writing these grants and securing these grants and managing these grants. But what does it give us, and then what does it take? And then how does that inform sort of how we move forward with deciding which grants do we pursue, and how do we go about that? So I think that, Madhu already mentioned this, and I think Shadi did as well, is that, there are a lot of things that we get from getting funds to, for our research programs. So one is that it gives us the opportunity to do things that we believe in, right? It could be pursuing a new idea, but at the same time also, I think it gives us the opportunity to learn about how we want to develop our programs. What kinds of programs do we want to build? What emphasis do we want to play on the process for research, the kinds of research we do, the kinds of data collection or methodologies that we use? It gives us the opportunity to experiment with key elements of what we want to do for the long term in our career. And that's been my experience. The grants that I have gotten have really helped me to develop my research programs in a way that I get what I think is the most satisfaction. I enjoy doing collaborative research across multiple disciplines. I love to do capacity strengthening activities, and I love to engage in stakeholder activities or stakeholder engagement as part of the outputs, not only the journal publications, but also the stakeholder engagement component is also important. I also think that one of the great things that have come out of the grant writing process, as well as the opportunity to manage these grants, is the opportunity to work with great minds and build and strengthen your research network. Out of the process of writing grants is where you learn about who you want to work with the next time, and also who maybe you don't want to work with. But I think it's also how you signal whether you're going to be what kind of collaborator you are. And so I think that that's also an important part of the process, as well as the implementation of the grant. I think that it's part of the path to tenure, right? So I think many of us already know that in our institutions, you need to demonstrate that you have a well-funded program when you're going up for promotion. And that means that you need to demonstrate that you have good ideas that are well recognized by your peer, but also is well funded. People see the value of what you have to offer. And then actually in many instances and growing in many institutions, some positions are actually funded 100% by grants. And so it's actually often can be a matter of job security that you're able to secure a grant for your position. But what does it take? It takes a lot of time. You need to build in time to write the grant, to take the idea and package it in a way that is very clear, cohesive, and aligns with your funder's objectives. But you also need to take the time to get through all the institutional requirements for the grant, which might be institutional requirements at your institution, the funding agency institution, as well as your partner institutions. Time to get through the pain of rejection, right? It's never nice to get your grants rejected, but not only do you have to quickly get over that, but you also now need to repackage that idea to another funder. And even if it's the same idea, the amount of time required to repackage it to a new funder who has their own institutional requirements and their own funding objectives or goals is non-trivial. So it can almost be like you're starting from scratch all over again. If you get the grant, then there's even more work, right? Now you need to deliver on all that you said you were going to do. And there's a significant amount of effort going into setting up the project, managing people, managing the research process, and also on the reporting. So this is one thing that I think is often underappreciated. At least I think throughout my career, I learned about being very strategic because different funders have different expectations about the nature of the reporting and the timing. Some may only require you to report once a year, but if you want to report, the reporting is not only ticking the boxes of all that you have done, but it's also the time to tell your story, which is an important part of communicating to your funder that you are a good steward of their resources, but also a good time for you to reflect on the process and on the findings and on what you are doing in a way that can also improve on how you make decisions about what you do next. And so even if you're only reporting once a year, building in processes for continually evaluating what you're doing in the project and making necessary adjustments is really critical, and it takes a lot of time. At the same time is that you might have other funders who are going to require quarterly reports or every half year or require monthly meetings or spring upon you requests for meetings or for you to engage in one way or the other. And a lot of my work is funded by funders like USAID, the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, the US, the UK, FCDO. So they all have their own different expectations, but it's always important that there's communication happening between you and the funder, and throughout the process, and that really requires also a bit of time. So now I just want to share a couple of reflections from my experience. It's my own unique experience, and I'm going to try to highlight on what I think might be relevant for a lot of early career scholars, but it's also my experiences, so that's a disclaimer. So actually, my experience with grant writing started very early, with my first experience writing the grant under the guidance of my advisor at UIUC. And this was for a grant that was called the Norman Borlaug Leadership Enhancement in Agriculture Program. It was meant for Africans, and it was looking for ideas that were going to contribute to the field, but also for people who had like some sort of leadership potential. And that experience was really instrumental for me in several ways. It funded primary data collection, which significantly improved the quality of my dissertation. It actually exposed me to a lot of other researchers. There's where I started my relationship with the International Food Policy Research Institute because it required you to have a CGIAR mentor. And it was also a highly prestigious and competitive award that built up my CV. So when I was applying for it, it was just the resources I was thinking about to get, to fund my work. But actually, my encouragement to a lot of grad students is that where there's opportunities for small competitive grants in your university or that you can do whilst you are a student, these can be actually instrumental for not only funding travel or funding the work that you do, but also signaling your potential and the fact that you have good ideas. So taking advantage of these. A couple of other things that I really learned that actually have added or have used subsequently is the importance of how you sell your idea. So I saw how my advisor worked with me to take a more technical idea about, research I was going to do in rural Ethiopia to understand the role of social networks in technology adoption and trying to identify the impact of these networks, all the indigeneity issues, and focus more on the technical aspects. And he worked with me to take that idea and to make it into a very clear story, a clear proposal that not only documented the value of this funding for a dissertation, but for an important contribution that would be made to the literature and that would be made to the development field, and an investment that would have much more impact because of the potential that I had. And I saw how he worked with me to tell that story. I also saw how he worked to ensure that the proposal was very cohesive. Different elements had different expectations, and each section was given enough attention, and then the story was complementary, it was well tied together, and it was simply communicated. I mentioned this because this is very important. I'm currently reviewing some proposals for the German Research Foundation, and it's so interesting to see how, even when we become more mature scholars, how we can oftentimes get boggled with what we're trying to propose we want to do and lose sight of how we have to be very clear to the audience that they can see the value of the work, they can see how it clearly responds to their objectives, but we can tell a cohesive story where each section is very well articulated. And that was something that I learned from that experience. And it was kind of amazing to me to see how that was done in that small 20,000 proposal. Second thing that that proposal and that experience taught me was actually how to build and manage a team and a budget. So learning how to fund my travel, I was going to rural Ethiopia and I spent almost a year there. I had to fund my living expenses, and then I had to fund the data collection that I was going to incur, hiring enumerators, collecting the data, getting the data entered. In those days, I didn't have the CAPI, so it was paper, and then how it was going to be entered, all the mechanisms to make sure that the data quality was preserved. And that really taught me about how to manage a team, build a team, the dynamics of building a team, even with that $20,000. But then I also had to learn about negotiating and pooling resources. Many times we think that we have an idea and we need $30,000 and we have maybe only 15,000. But I learned through that experience about how you can take your $20,000, you need $27,000, and you can reach out to other funders and show how what their maybe $5,000 can do to make the impact of the $20,000 move from X to 2X or to 1.5X just by adding $5,000. Sometimes it could be articulating to a funder how their own interest can be served by them just complementing the resources and the work that you're already going to be doing with existing resources. So the power of using existing resources and experiences to pool resources, I think, is something that I learned from this experience and which I have actually found to be very useful in securing funding for my students, as well as securing funding for my research since then. So now I also want to talk about building on the past. So I mentioned earlier that grants are also a path to another grant. By leading a grant and successfully implementing it, you demonstrate that you have that capacity and it becomes the basis for your next grant, demonstrating that you have the ability to do that. When I got to MSU, I was fortunate to be part of a team that was going to be doing work on input supply chains in Africa, and it was working across multiple countries. Nigeria was not yet part of that portfolio, but I had been a postdoc and I had worked in Nigeria and I had worked on the fertilizer supply chain, and I had this idea that I wanted to engage in. Through being part of this larger team, I was able to develop my own program, but have it plugged into a broader program. That gave me the opportunity to learn from my senior colleagues who were leading the effort, how, the details of how to, kind of feed my idea into that proposal. But I also had the independence of being able to design what I wanted to do. And I took a lot of the lessons I had learned from managing my $20,000 project in Ethiopia, built into it in terms of how I wanted to work with my team, the kind of team I wanted to work, the kind of data I wanted to collect, how I was going to do my data collection, the innovations I wanted to implement around data collection, also the ideas I had about capacity strengthening, which is something that I do enjoy doing and was also a beneficiary of, and so always build into my research programs. And then I found out that, that experience also taught me some of the nuances of how do you actually also deliver on a grant now when you're not a PhD student, but you actually have to have the research publications, and then you also have to have the team management, all of that done as well. And interestingly, my theory of change, my risks that I was able to take, I was able to build some of them into this smaller grant that was about $700,000. And then that became the basis for my $12.5 million grant. So when I was asked to do it, to pursue it, I came in and I had these ideas that I had, learned from the previous grants, and I was able to build those in to the proposal. And I was able to also demonstrate the experience I had from the previous grants to make what I was proposing, which was a bit risky and maybe different, but actually had the potential to be successful. And again, in my more recent grant, I found that when I was talking with the funders, this one is funded by the Gates Foundation, some of the things that resonated with them were the detailed examples I gave about what it was like to actually collect data, complex data in a developing country context, how to use experiments, and or quasi-experimental approaches with just cross-sectional data analysis, and just being able to show how to work with a team, how to building capacity strengthening, and demonstrating that I had the experience from these previous projects. So continually using those past experiences as the evidence going forward, but also learning each time about what kinds of risks can I take as I want to develop this approach for doing my research. I want to highlight that in my experience, I have been very fortunate to have excellent mentorship. I talked about the experience I had with my advisor. He taught me about the importance of clarity and cohesion. And I think that if I want to leave with a message, that is something that is really key when you're writing a proposal, being able to communicate very clearly, ensure that you are answering and providing the details for all the sections of the proposal in a very clear way that the reader, even if they're not an expert in your specific area, can see that this is a carefully thought out idea, it makes sense, and that there's cohesion between the different sections, even though each section is independently complete in and of itself. And I'm saying this because like I mentioned, even reviewing proposals now, I still see that this is oftentimes missed. And so you read the whole proposal, you can get a sense of the idea, but if you're evaluating, many times evaluations are done section by section, and if the elements that are needed for the evaluation are not in there, you can lose a lot of points because you have a nice idea, but it's not clearly communicated, or it's not brought together in a way that responds explicitly to the request or the requirements of the call. My mentor at the CG Center taught me the importance of networking. Just like Shadi mentioned, you need to have coffee, you need to go for the seminars, you need to present at the seminars, you need to share your ideas in any way that you can. And in many cases, it's over coffee, it's over a meal that these ideas are shared, and people say, oh, that's interesting. And then you can be invited to be part of a team or even to lead a team, as was also my experience at MSU. When I got to MSU, I shared my ideas, and one of them was actually over coffee. As a new faculty member, I was invited. And so I want to mention that we as senior scholars can play a role in creating an atmosphere for younger scholars to come in and have a space to bring those ideas. You must have the ideas, obviously, but having the space to also be part of a team that can allow you to navigate those nuances can also be very helpful. And that has been part of my journey, even though I had to manage the grants, but having the space to do that was important. So I mentioned that I had this $12.5 million grant, and I can understand why people say it's not recommended for maybe an early career scholar, but like I said, I would pursue that opportunity again because it gave me the space to really do some really great work, high quality work that had some impact in the countries that I was working in, but taught me a lot about what I wanted to do, and has also been the basis for my subsequent grants and also for my research program. But yes, it was a large grant. I had to manage a lot of different people, and I had to manage my time very efficiently because it was difficult to manage the grant, administer it, report on it, do my research, keep my research productivity up, because that also is key for subsequent grants, and then manage my family and my life, keep sane. But my suggestion is not to run away from these large grants, but to select your team carefully. So if I was to do things again, I think building in adequate time and funds for the support that you're going to need. Sometimes you need one grant manager, sometimes you need multiple, depending on how complex that grant is. Build in all the resources you need to have excellent grant management, people that are highly qualified, carefully recruited, that are going to take off your time from having to do things that are not absolutely necessary, and that allow you to focus on what you want to focus on, which in my case was my research and the ability to think and to have the vision, build my vision, and to do the research that I wanted to do. Bringing in, if you have strong interest in communications, stakeholder engagement, have people that are designated just to focus on that as a full-time position. Having just 5% of somebody's time, 10% can seem like a lot, but it may not be enough. Ensure that you are adequately funded to deliver on what you need to do for all the aspects of the project. Having postdoctoral fellows can be very helpful for continuing your research at the level that you need it to be. In addition to maybe having, graduate students, having postdoctoral fellows or younger faculty that can come and work with you is also key, and things that I would have done differently. I think it's important to also have dependable partners that you work with. When you have a team, it has to be diverse. You need to have the thinkers, you need to have the implementers, you need to have the communication experts, you need to have those who are also going to be willing to do heavy lifting, because leadership can be lonely and the ball stops with you. So at the end of the day, if the report is not written, you have to write it. If it's not written well, you have to do it. If there's any issues on the financial management, it's coming back to you. So building in a team that you can depend on to help you get these aspects of it, which are just they're just as important as also getting the research done. It's not an either or. So you must do, everything that you say you're going to do, and the funder expects all of that. Having the wrong team members can significantly affect the atmosphere of the work that you do, the quality of the work, and the impact of the work. So I think Shadi gave some good suggestions. Be very careful and deliberate about the members of your team. And so to end, I just want to leave with two messages. One is that when writing grants, clarity is key and less can be more. Provide the input and the justification and the material that the funder has asked, the way it's been asked, in a way that is very clear. And then also, don't run away from the large grants if you can. Be strategic, pursue ambitious grants with confidence, but design them wisely. Ensure you have adequate support to do what you need to do, and choose your collaborators carefully, and then be the kind of partner that you would trust and want. Thank you.
Thanks, Saweda. All right, our third panelist today is Elena Irwin. She is, let me just get this. Elena is the director of the Sustainability Institute and a distinguished university professor at the Ohio State University in the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics. She obtained her PhD from the University of Maryland. She's an expert in spatial models of land use change, integrated modeling of ecosystem services, and sustainability assessment at regional scales. What's really somewhat unique about Elena is that not only does she conduct externally funded interdisciplinary research herself, but she's also led to the growth of the interdisciplinary research programs in sustainability at the university through her leadership as a founding director. So she enables and helps teams come together to get large interdisciplinary, externally funded grants from numerous different federal and agencies and other funders. So really happy to have you here, Elena, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Madhu, and thank you, Vincenzina, for inviting me, and happy to be part of this. And this is just a real tour de force that you've heard from Shadi and also from Saweda. So I will add just a little bit to the conversation. I think what you're hearing from our panelists, and probably what you've also experienced yourself if you've done some grant writing, is that it's a really fun and creative process. I mean, it's like we all love ideas, right? That's why we're in the business that we're in. And when you're writing a grant proposal, you get to dream and think about new research questions. And as Saweda said, you have to really make the compelling case for why, right? You have to be very, you challenge yourself to not only have the big vision, but then also translate that into how you're going to implement it. Who's the research team? What's the plan, the objectives, the tactics that we're going to use, and then of course the budget, because if you don't have a budget, then you have nothing. So it's putting all of those pieces together, and I have always found it to be such a fun puzzle to do. Of course, you're often doing it in a team, and that's also part of the fun. But we're economists. We understand that everything comes with a cost, and so we have to also ask ourselves, Is this worthwhile? Is it worth the opportunity cost? What is the opportunity cost of writing this proposal? Do I really need this research grant? And how is it going to advance my research goals? And be very specific about that. And I think you really have to convince yourself of those things before diving into writing something, because as everybody is reflecting, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort. So usually the opportunity cost of doing these things is quite high. Madhu, if you could go to the next slide. I think it's also particularly early on in your career to think about, how do getting research grants show up in terms of the things that we're expected to do and the things that we're going to be evaluated on. Oftentimes you might hear, depending on who you talk to, that grants are just a research input, right? They're not actually research output, they're research input. They're an input into doing the research, producing the papers, driving the impacts, broader impacts as well, and as in terms of stakeholder engagement and other things. But they don't actually count as an output. Now, of course, other people might say that they do count as an output. The very fact that you were able to write a compelling grant and to receive the funding, particularly if it's competitive, is evidence of the quality of your thoughts and the quality of the thinking. So, many times some people would count receiving a research grant and securing research grants as an output. Other times people might say it's a signal, right? It's a signal of the quality of the research. That would be particularly true if it's from a very, prestigious source, NSF and very competitive or something like that. And then other times people might say that grants are pathways to other researchers, as we've been talking about, they open up new areas of inquiry, new networks of people and organizations to get to know. Madhu, if you could go to the next slide. It really is, in my opinion, all of these things. Sorry. Yeah, it was the check marks. All of those things are, I think, what grants get you. In my own experience, I have followed, I think, probably a more kind of typical linear path in terms of the level of the grants that I was able to get. As a graduate student, probably like many of you, I was supported on a grant. And that really was an incredible learning opportunity to see how to do the research. And it was a very interdisciplinary land use kind of hydrology-based system that we were modeling and studying. And so it really set me on the path of, what I ended up spending a lot of my own research interests focused on. As an assistant professor, I did start with a lot of smaller internal seed grants, and being lucky at OSU, we have quite a few of those, either from our college or from university-wide centers or institutes. And so that was very important for my development. And that would be one of the things I would encourage everyone to look for, those opportunities. And then at the same time, I also looked for opportunities to be part of larger grants. And I ended up finding a NSF coupled human natural systems opportunity. Shadi talked about that NSF program. And it was really mind-blowing for me, because I was working with biologists and physicists and hydrologists and all kinds of people that I had not worked with before. And so it was a huge learning experience. And the other learning experience about that is that we did not get it funded on the first time. We did not get it funded on the second time, but we did get it funded on the third time. And so that's just, more evidence of sticking with something and, not expecting to always get it funded on the first time. As I became then an associate and full professor, I started to lead more projects myself, including, some medium-sized projects, for example, from NSF Geography and Spatial Sciences, and then was, a co-PI on larger things like $10 million or higher. I was part of a long-term ecological research site in Baltimore that was funded through NSF and got over $10 million in funding. My first larger grant that I led was also from NSF, a little over $2 million. And that was, once you step into managing those level of grants, you really do become a project manager, and a lot of administrative effort to lead things like that, particularly if they're interdisciplinary. And then another thing I would point out is that, federal funding is not the only source. And I also, was receiving funds from local governments, from industry, from foundations. And that kind of diversification is super important, especially, in this moment in time where the federal funding landscape is so uncertain. And now as Institute Director, while I do continue to serve as a PI and co-PI on a few grants, I spend the bulk of my time helping other people. And so I am the one providing the strategic guidance, helping to develop the team, develop partnerships, whether they're internal and external. Shadi mentioned team science. That's a really important aspect of how, the best practices of team formation, as well as how teams interact with each other to be productive. And I also, sometimes I end up not, if not directly leading something, helping others to lead. And these are really large, complex proposals that, take a lot of effort. And so if I can take some of the administrative burden off of the PI, so the PI can, focus on their research and focus on the vision and the big ideas, then that's a positive. And I see that as part of my role. Next slide. So, how has this kind of opportunity influenced my own career? It's been absolutely fundamental. My topic, in land use and environmental interactions is very interdisciplinary. And so to get these larger grants has really been fundamental to being able to advance my career. And I think, overall, because sometimes you do spend a lot more time on the interdisciplinary grants and formulating the research. It honestly takes longer than disciplinary work. For me, that's translated into fewer publications overall than what I think I otherwise would have had, but also with much higher citations than I think I would have had. So I think a trade-off there, but also an advantage, is just the impact of your work can be much higher. And you also get just broader exposure to natural scientists. And then that connects you to other groups of researchers and gives you more opportunities to get involved. For example, on advisory boards, whether that's with NSF or US EPA, National Academy of Sciences, are some of the opportunities that I've had. But I think it's because I've done that interdisciplinary work. So next slide, and that's my last slide. Just my top 10 grant advice for early career people. One, understand the value of the grants to you and others in your organization. If they're not valued at all, you should consider that. And two, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, but because you should never let someone else fully determine your choices. You should certainly take that into consideration in terms of how you are being rewarded for the effort that you're putting in. My advice is to start small and build on your successes. I would avoid leading a large grant proposal initially because it's just too much administration, but don't shy away from, being on a large proposal and on a large team. Just be very sure of what your role is on that team. Be willing to take some intentional risks and expect to fail, sometimes a lot, but also never give up. There's always going to be a home and an opportunity to get funding from somewhere. You just have to figure out where that is. And I think in this day and age right now, particularly, being willing to play, quote unquote, the economist role on a larger project, even if it's not exactly in your specific area, is a smart strategy if you're looking to get funding. Because right now, because of the funding landscape being what it is, we may not be able to get funding in our exact area. And so being willing to be a little nimble, in the interim, I think is not a bad strategy. I always say allow funding for either a GRA or a postdoc. I just think, that's so important. That's part of what we're doing, is training the next generation. And so I always would advise to try to support either GRA or a postdoc. And then, as others have said, leveraging the support and resources from your university, from your department, so that you can stretch your budget as far as possible. And look for interdisciplinary centers and institutes that are aligned with your area. They can really help you a lot in terms of matchmaking and helping you, particularly when it comes to those larger complex proposals. And if you do get a grant and you are a PI, just be prepared to be a highly organized project manager. And that's a whole nother skill set that we don't necessarily learn when we're grad students, but it's a very valuable skill set. And sometimes universities will have training sessions for those sorts of things, for leading research grants. And if you have that opportunity, definitely take advantage. My last piece of advice is always work with nice, generous, curiosity-driven people. Some people are resource hogs, and you'll learn that through experience when you're managing a grant and someone's sucking up all your budget. Not a good situation. Don't work with those people. And if you do find yourself in that situation, resolve to not work with that person again. But when you do find good collaborators, definitely keep them.
All right. Thanks, Elena. All right, so we are now in the Q&A portion of, we have about 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes. And I'm going to stop sharing. So feel free to put questions in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that as well, and I will look out for that. Maybe just to get us started, I think Shadi, you mentioned that very often when as an early career researcher, you might be invited to be on a grant as an economist, and that may simply be doing some simple financial cost calculations of new technologies or some farm level activities and so on, which really reflect people not fully understanding what economists do and what our toolkit is. How do you determine, and you also said, well, it takes a while to educate other disciplines about what we do as economists. How do you what is your advice on knowing whether to participate, which grants to participate in, which have the potential for more deeper work, and how do you get around to really educating your other project members about what economics, how rich a discipline it can be?
Yeah, I think initially one might not have the luxury of the choice. So initially it might be just a matter of taking it if they only want what they want. But as Elena is saying, if you include GRA, then your grad student will be able to do that as the RA for the grant, and then build on it, use those parameter values to parameterize a model that they're going to use later on that's going to be the publishable one. So initially you might not have a lot of options. When I started having options, I would, it's funny, it's almost like, you're showing the portfolio of things you could do. I'll say we could do this, and then the next step we could do that, and then we could do this, and we can do that. And there's like a menu. And then if I have one collaborator who's excited about that final product, and somebody else who's only interested in that, and you could tell that they're more interested in everybody doing their thing in their corner, that's less interesting. So I end up then, if I have the choice, and then I'll say, maybe not this time, because it was clear that they just wanted to check box the social sciences box, versus the co-PI who got excited about, oh my God, I can use this because that can inform in real time how we are developing this thing. Instead of developing the technology and then worrying whether the farmer is going to adopt it, we can use that information in real time to redesign the way, what properties it has. And then I think there is a role for the profession as a whole, because there must have been some reviewers on some grants who have said, no, in this case, you need to look at we need a dynamic model. So go back and look for some economists who can help you with a farm level dynamic model of decision making, because then I'll get somebody that I've never heard of who end up being like, a prominent plant pathologist saying, somebody told us that we need to develop this thing. What does it mean, a bioeconomic model? What does it do to us? What data does it need? What does it even mean? It's not something I heard of in my Econ 101, right? Like this is a lot of your PIs have just taken Econ 101. And so I feel like there's a role. I can't believe it's just like what I published, they happen to see it. There must have been somebody who's sitting on the NIFA panel who said, you need this. And then they came back, and then you start receiving emails from people you didn't know. And it was both your work, telling others about what other exciting things you could do with them. And I'm guessing other people in the discipline who are reviewing proposals and recommending you could do this more powerful thing. And then that leads to somebody contacting another economist in the profession. And so I think it's that leads to people over time having learned more about what we do. So it's both the individual and the collective that can help with that impact on the people in other disciplines.
Yeah, thanks. Any questions from our audience? If not, really quickly, Saweda, we've seen a lot of uncertainty with funding, particularly USAID in the last year or so. And so, how with these large grants, how do you deal with uncertainty? How do you prepare for it? And then how do you adapt?
Yes. So I think that in terms of a general strategy, it's good to diversify diversify your risks. So I think that where it's possible to ensure that you have funding, so you have funding from USAID, but then funding from the Gates Foundation or the World Bank and others. I think having multiple sources of funding in your pipeline is in your pipeline and in your portfolio is important. However, in some cases where you are, you do have this kind of situations, I think what has happened in the last year is sort of unprecedented and kind of, was a shock to everyone. But I think that generally one of the strategies that I use is I'm always thinking about how to collect data and have data for analysis for a long period of time. And so I think that, have with that kind of a strategy. So for example, I do a lot of primary data collection and maybe you have a cross-sectional data set, but then what you want is to have a panel. So then, you can, write to a funder and then you're not asking for such a large amount because you already have a lot of the setup. The framework is already there. You can get additional funding to then go and improve the quality of the data that you have. And so I think having these kind of strategies where I'm thinking of the fact that I want to have a large amount of data that can answer the questions I want to answer and keep, kind of keep my research activities ongoing for me and my grad students, right? So that's one way you can still have, the basis for continuing doing your research. And then you may just be looking for $50,000 here to cover your RA because you lost the funding from the project, but they have their data that they can use for their dissertation. So I think always bearing in mind that, you have a more medium to long-term strategy for your funding, for your research program, generating data in the case of, international development work that I do, but then creating space where if you have a shock like that, you can then focus on sort of keeping your team members as much as possible funded to keep the work ongoing, and then diversify your sources. I think is an important one that we've had to do. Yeah.
Yep, thanks. Elena, we've got a lot of early career researchers, on the call, and one of the questions that comes up is like, recognition for interdisciplinary research and journals on the P&T process and balancing the need for disciplinary publications versus interdisciplinary publications and single author or multi-author. And with these large team grants, you get drawn into these large multi-authored papers where it can sometimes be hard to show your individual contribution. So what advice would you give for how to balance?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Madhu, and I think it's very important. One of the pieces of advice that we give here at Ohio State is, it's really important to know how to tell your story. And you have colleagues who are evaluating you who may not know how to do interdisciplinary research or transdisciplinary research. They may not understand the unique challenges of those types of research. And so it's up to you to communicate that and to be able to translate the value of that research into things that they can also understand. We have a PDF that's posted online. I'm happy to send the URL out afterwards, but it's basically 3 pages of how to tell your story, for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. So I would highly recommend, thinking about that, because communicating what you do, how you do it, why it's important, and being able to communicate that effectively to your colleagues is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking the time to prepare and tell us about their journey and all the experiences and advice for getting funding and managing it productively. And I'd like to thank the audience for being here and sticking it out. So thank you all very much. And I believe this will be posted, the recording will be posted. So if you want to go back and listen to it, and again, it'll be there. So thank you, everyone.
Madhu, I just put the link to that PDF
Okay.
in the chat. If anyone wants to
Okay.
look at it.
Yeah, great. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.